have control. Hi everyone. Shall we get started? Cool. Thank you. Welcome to my talk, Puzzles to be Explored but Not Solved, Designing Ambiguous Navigable Worlds. Feel free to tweet during this talk if you like. If you have any questions and you don't want to ask after the presentation, you can @ me while I'm doing my talk, and I promise I'll get back to you today at the very least, or you can have a chat to me afterwards. Anyway, let's get started. So, who am I? I'm Alexander Muscat. I'm a local from Melbourne. I make research and teach game design and development, basically. I do experimental games. I teach level design at RMIT and some other subjects. And last year I completed a PhD within the area of game design. And today, what I'll be sharing with you is part of my research and part of my creative work, which is an approach to designing game worlds, and particularly game levels, that prioritizes ambiguity, which is an area that's not really discussed in game design at large. And so today, I hope to shed some light on this kind of elusive design space and these types of experiences of ambiguity for designers and perhaps narrative designers in the audience here, which I feel is somewhat fitting with the conference theme of lighting the way. So, what I'll be talking about today is a project of mine. It's a game you can play. I'll have a link to it at the end, and it's called World 4. And this is a multi-dimensional kind of world explorer game where players explore a mysterious, interconnected world created to be explored but not fully understood. It's been described as being like inside a puzzle that's explored but not solved. The key to it, as you can see on the screen, is that there's 4 first-person perspectives happening at once. The world is fragmented, basically, split and layered across each view like they're separate lenses. These contradict each other or they connect. A split pathway might be visible in one and invisible in another. Things might look completely different. But what's key to World 4 is that there's no kind of stated goals or guides. It's purely an exploratory experience about unraveling this kind of deliberately unintuitive and elusive and at times unsettling space. What I wanted to do is create the sensation of being lost and adjusting to a place for the first time, disorientation being a key part, having to come to terms with your surroundings in order to understand it, and having this uncertainty that there's more to discover out there that you might not quite see. So, World 4's had many different versions. I've made this thing over a few years as part of my PhD research. It has one of the versions includes this multi-screen version that's meant to be a social experience. Each of those views is output to different monitors. It was created basically to investigate and address some design questions I had when I was researching into exploration in games, which I'll get into. During the time that I've made it, I've submitted to a bunch of festivals. It received some nominations at a Maze Festival this year, and at Free Play last year in the experimental game categories. And you might have seen it at some local venues and events and so on. I know some of my students here might have seen it around RMIT. Currently it's being redeveloped into a commercial project, which is tentatively called World 4.2 or World 420. It's a friend gets credit for that. And core to all these different versions and kind of like deviations of World 4 is this idea of ambiguity, basically at its core. So today I'll guide you through my underlying motivations and inspirations in creating World 4. And from this, I'll share with you 6 practical takeaways. Actually 4. I have 6, but I can only address 4 today, limited time, that I learned from developing and researching World 4 and creating ambiguous explorable worlds. So much of what makes up World 4 is from my background in research looking into walker games, or as otherwise known as walking simulators, as you might call them. I prefer to call them walkers because there's a bit of cultural baggage in calling them walking simulators. But to kind of like summarize, if you're not familiar with walker games, to kind of summarize them, they're known for reprioritizing a lot of existing game conventions, like exploration of first-person environments that you might find in like a shooter or RPG game, but instead for kind of solitary navigation experiences, where you're kind of navigating these beautiful ambient atmospheric worlds, sometimes with the narrative element involved. These games prioritize like looking, listening, moving as the main interactions. There's little challenge, mechanics like complex mechanics or anything, or failure states. Sometimes there's environmental storytelling and things that in other games might be in the background. You might say as a kind of set dressing or like visual decoration. But instead, these are heightened and prioritized in walker games. They come to the forefront. And for me, I had a long-standing interest over time as to why I was so drawn to these kinds of experiences. Without like a lot of these things going on in these games exists within other genres and other types of games. But what is it here without those other aspects, without those other mechanics and complexities, makes them so compelling? And I became very frustrated at the lack of language to kind of articulate what this experience is, particularly within game design spaces, because most conversations are caught up in, are they games, aren't they games, which really debilitates actually getting to the core of what are these design qualities. This is even more frustrating to me because I have a real interest in modding and demo scene stuff. And there's a really rich history of these kinds of spatial experimentation, exploration in games that can be linked to the walker. For instance, first-person shooter mods is something I'm very interested in, such as the original Diressa mod for Half-Life 2, which transforms the shooter into a ghost story. There's architectural visualization in Unreal Tournament, and then turning Wolfenstein 3D into a perceptual maze. A lot of these kinds of interesting like demo scene mods highlight these complexities in navigating game spaces and ideas of like exploration and solitude as experiences in themselves. So with all this kind of like stuff that was like motivating me and inspiring me, I took this like deep dive into looking at walker games as part of my research to kind of understand what are these traits? How do they set themselves apart from video games at large and make their experiences of exploration distinct? And what I found is that there's like quite a lot of similarities across many different games. And here's just a few that I looked at. There's like standardized movement controls, mouse and keyboard and little else. So you're directed at the audio visual. No kind of gameplay conflicts, a lot of navigation and walking, of course. Which extends the feeling of time passing, and then not much information on screen. Instead, it's mostly just you observing a world and focusing on the level, which guides and pulls your attention in different ways to kind of draw your curiosity. So I also looked at a lot of kind of game design theory and literature, a lot of GDC talks. And while there's a lot of fantastic knowledge out there, a lot of this kind of popular established game design theory in like areas of game design, level design, experience design, didn't quite help articulate these qualities that I was interested in, particularly how these games tap into our desire to explore and discover. So what I had to do was look abroad into other fields of knowledge, particularly in art and design. Now, I could go on for a while about this kind of exploration, but instead I'll tell you where I ended up. And that's that walker games de-emphasize being gamed or solved. Instead, they're about interpretive openness as you navigate, which is core to that feeling of exploration. Not just exploration of the game space, the level to walk around in, but also the kind of exploration of the mind as you begin to read the environment and interpret it different ways. This is a trait of ambiguity in walker games, which is helpfully defined as a property of the interpretive relationship between people and artifacts that can be intriguing, mysterious, or delightful. So throughout these different Walker games, there's a suggestion of meaning embedded in these kinds of visual aspects of the level, or the architecture of it, the geometry, the iconography, that really gets you kind of reading and imagining how these things connect and what they might mean. So a huge influence in helping me kind of like articulate this aspect wasn't in the game space, it was within the area of art and design and research, which of course is pretty telling as I'm doing a PhD and looking at a lot of research at the time. There's a guy, William Gaver, who's an artist and a designer, and also a teacher at Goldsmiths University in London. And he does these kinds of like weird industrial designs that are placed in the public spaces and designed to kind of like thwart easy interpretation and require people to kind of like approach them differently and try and understand what is going on here with this thing. There's this table, for instance, that has like this satellite view, and you can kind of move this satellite view around very slowly by pushing the edges of the table. But that view's framed in this very small window, so you have to concentrate on specific details, from above. Or like these public broadcasting TVs that have like kind of poetry on loop. And the interesting thing about these experiments of his is that like the ambiguity doesn't prescribe a result. Instead, the kind of work of like understanding and comprehending these kinds of the qualities of these things belongs to the person, the individual, which can lead to different kinds of takes and conceptual appropriation, you could say, of the artifact. So the design is actually working a lot more like an artist, which is a bit interesting. Anyway, that's a big discussion in itself. So I kind of took this knowledge and then looked at Walker games and found there's like these different kinds of ambiguity within them. An ambiguity of information, like the idea of secrets being kind of like unraveled. The suggestion of different choices and then something outside of your view that you didn't select, like different pathways. Context, so the idea of seeing one thing from an angle, like this hairspray as blood splatter from a doorway and gone home, and then you enter the bathroom and you're like, oh, it's not blood splatter, it's actually hair dye. So seeing things from different angles and then interpreting them differently. And then relationships. So the idea of like, in games, you reuse a lot of art assets, right? It's quite economical to do that. But the idea of using those kinds of repeating art assets and iconography to create interpretive gaps. So players go like, how do these things connect? And it's being used this thing that's repeating is being used in a particular way right now, which might have some significance and relate to what I saw earlier. Of course, these qualities are present in many other games, not just Walker's, but Walker's intensify this aspect, taking these things that are usually background or decorative elements and put them into focal points within the game levels, which players often seek out when they're exploring and navigating. So from doing all this stuff, I kind of came up with these 7 initial guiding ideas for taking like this research and then putting it into a design, basically. And this was great and all, but there was a bit of a problem. You spend a lot of time, doing research, you're buried in books and theories and everything, and as you're doing that, the world changes around you, especially when you spend years of your life looking into these things, and it's so time-consuming. I'm sure a lot of you developers are like, you spend years making a game and the same thing can happen. So what I found is that as I was starting my research and as I kept looking into things, the landscape of the genre, the Walker genre, rapidly grew beyond its roots, underwent massive cultural shifts, and it kind of exploded. You have games like Firewatch and Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and Tacoma, which are much more focused on storytelling and kind of higher production values. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are these very small, solo developer-made kind of atmospherically focused exploration games, stuff like Kitty Horror Shows games or Mushlink, even Grace Bruxner's very kind of bold and expressive little exploratory environments. And with all this stuff happening, what it realized is like there's real limitations to studying games. You know, research dates and ages as everything does. And I kind of hit a wall in understanding, okay, like ambiguity in design, game worlds, can't really understand much from just studying things. I need to find out a different way to investigate. So this went into a design experiment, which became World 4, putting these ideas of ambiguity that I initially drummed up into practice. And I'm lucky because this wasn't a commercial project, it was purely experimental and for research purposes. Of course, there's not always the luxury of time, but what it allowed for me while doing this as research is go through a lot of iterations. And I can like show you some now. So this is like the first recording of World 4 on a mobile phone in a research, in an office actually at RMIT. And what I was going for here, playing around with the multiple displays, was just heightening that interaction of looking. You know, experimenting with having different things on screen at one time, and then also like using a lot of contrasting, high contrast and flat materials, so things really stand out and are super bold, or they're completely hard to see. I also really liked the sense of disorientation that also kind of like acted as its own experience. I also had just some nice ambient music playing in the background on a speaker, because it matched with it well. There were many other tests and experiments, lots of alternative versions and everything, and like this kaleidoscope view which didn't quite work because you can only see like fractions of the screen, and it doesn't have that, you know, that kind of like simultaneous effect. And also a lot of experiments in terms of layering and branching the environment. So one particularly difficult thing to consider when making a game for 4 views is the amount of layering that has to go into a level. For instance, designing 4 levels at once on top of each other, not very fun. So there was a lot of difficulty in terms of working out where things go, what the workflow is, and so on. An absolute headache. Another thing is trying to think about how a game level can basically like not just loop on it in itself, but draw the player in different ways. So I spent a lot of time looking at tried and tested game level design theories, like branching hub and spokes models, you know, different ways of concealing things. There's some good literature out there and GDC talks that I'd be happy to share. But I ended up looking more at shopping centres, particularly around Melbourne, like Melbourne Central. And it's just interesting how shopping centres and that kind of like architectural design, you know, uses different kinds of materials and lighting to disrupt your perception and kind of draw your eye and make you lose sense of time and place. And that was like pretty instrumental in trying to figure out things like color and placement of objects, as well as the layout of the level, which you can kind of see from this expanded view, that it's kind of like all structured around this kind of central chasm. So I had this thing, but I didn't really understand what I'd created. What is World 4? It's, you know, hard to tell when you're a player, but it's also hard to tell as someone who's created it. So I had to look for new ways to reveal insights, to help me find some sort of language to crystallize these thoughts and ideas that went into it. And what I do is research. So I researched with it. I got that game out in front of a lot of people, took it around internationally to different events, you know, different public spaces and everything, and sent it to people online for them to record themselves playing it, and so I could kind of like watch and take notes remotely on my own. And it was really interesting seeing different reactions. You know, people bounce off it, they're indifferent, or they loved it. People found it like disorientating and hard to understand, but then also that was part of the appeal, which is, sort of contradictory to how we think about design, good design and good user experience and so on. A lot of people are unsure about like the boundaries of the space. Like, is it a procedurally generated game? Are the rooms changing and so on? I can confirm they're not. It's all kind of preset, which was, all really interesting to me. So from doing all this research and kind of looking at this game in different ways, what I did find was a bunch of different ways for thinking about how you can design spatially ambiguous, explorable worlds. I've got 4. There's a few more, 6, but I can only fit 4 in. But you can find those online. I'll have a link to it afterwards. And these ways of thinking are specific to World 4, and I've got some quotes to kind of like give some context to them. But I also have some extra examples from other games, some old, some more recent, that can help you think about how you could perhaps use these ways of thinking for your own designs or your own different approaches to making game levels and navigable spaces. So the first is use multiple sets of incomplete information to support navigation. So it's obvious in World 4 that there's this like overt on-screen fragmentation through the 4 views. And of course, players spent a lot of time like triangulating between these 4 views to understand their surroundings and kind of figure out the space. And one player really helpfully described it as like a puzzle. The game is a puzzle to be explored but not solved. Now, the reason for this kind of weird thing of like, oh, it's not a puzzle you're solving but you're exploring, is because this game is about an information gap. It's about a game world concealed between multiple imprecise information sources. And by presenting these to the player, you can create a desire that, a desire to negotiate these information gaps and kind of like make people want to explore to see like, oh, what are the limitations of those different information sources? It is important, though, that if you give a player different information sources to kind of navigate, you need to treat each one as valuable in their own way to compel comparison. Otherwise, then people will focus on one instead of the other. If you want to disrupt that, you can introduce inconsistencies that kind of modify the reliability of each information source to highlight like the limitations of one and draw people to look at another. Of course, this can create disorientation, so you do want to find a bit of a balance. Now, this is actually something that's being worked on a bit more. A friend of mine and our colleague, Will Owen, has been experimenting for World 420 with a kind of like changing like viewports based on orientation and location near objects. So there's like much more room for exploration here, but to kind of dial it back to a classic example, in The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, there's the Lens of Truth, which is this nice little item that allows different things, another layer of the environment to be exposed. And this is mostly used for like navigating navigating like treacherous obstacles and avoiding enemies and things like that. But it's like a great example of like having an ability to create comparison basically and to slow down the game. Interestingly, within 2016, both Dishonored 2 and Titanfall 2 did a very interesting mechanic of switching between 2 versions of the same level. I've chosen Dishonored 2 because it expands on this a little more with this item called the timepiece, which an entire level was built around within that game. Now, what this provides is a preview of another version of the same level in a different time period, and the player can kind of switch between the two. What it encourages, though, with this like preview here, is for players to like sweep the environment almost like it's a dustbuster or something like that, to see the differences in advance before they make the jump into another time period. Neither environment can be fully seen at once with only one view kind of like partially seen through this like little window. So worth thinking about. The other is feedback. Now, a lot of good game design is about giving the player, proper feedback as to, their interactions and how the game responds. What I suggest is sometimes having no feedback isn't a bad thing. It can be quite a good thing for compelling spatial questions. So, for instance, World 4 has like this, reduced depth and everything, these kinds of weird things that you can't really tell when you're standing still and you have to move to figure them out. For instance, in this picture here, in this GIF, there's a vertical drop. And you can kind of see it in the diagram next to it. And this vertical drop can only really be understood if a player kind of moves up to it and kind of around the edges of it or falls down it. And what's helpful with the, this kind of removing of feedback is that it creates this uncertainty towards the game space and really forces people to think about and test its dimensions through colliding, rubbing against surfaces, changing your view, sidestepping, and so on. It can yield a very disorientating effect, having no feedback whatsoever, but it can become part of the fun of overcoming something that's difficult and tricky to comprehend and perceive. Removing audio-visual feedback can, kind of like raise question to, what are the dimensions of the game level? What is the dimensions of the space? How can I kind of like interact with it? And like, what are the spatial boundaries? Like, where does this go? So with World 4, a lot of people who didn't quite understand if, is this a doorway? Is this a drop? Is this a corridor? Would come back to have a look at things again and again to try and figure them out, even though, the level wasn't being very mazed or anything like that. So it kind of encourages memorization as well as kind of inquiry. I should have brought up the quote earlier, but like encouraging players to find their boundaries. Now, an interesting example of this is in Shadow of the Colossus. For those of you unfamiliar with it, you have this navigation aid, this sword, that fires a beam of light that becomes more constrained when it's pointing towards a destination. However, that beam of light goes through solid objects, mountainsides, towers, and so on. So you have a general idea of what direction to go in, sort of like a compass, but you don't know where the correct path is. And it gets very tricky when you're trying to navigate like winding directions or find the right route, and you have this sword that's pointing in the opposite direction. So it ends up introducing this sort of ambiguity between where the destination is and the different kinds of pathways you have and how you negotiate those pathways in order to get to the destination. Another really interesting example is the kind of options in Breath of the Wild in terms of turning off all the interface elements, like the map, the kind of like other HUD elements to guide you, and so on. One in particular, a really interesting choice, is the ability to only place so many markers, just a few markers on the map to know where destinations are or things to visit. I think you have 6 markers you can place on the map. And what's interesting is that by limiting the amount of feedback the player has in terms of like locations to visit, what is highlighted for them, it's just more easy for a player to get lost in the world because it directs focus towards the surroundings, like natural landmarks, things on the horizon, waypoints that might be visible like trees and so on, and also the overall aesthetic beauty of the environment. So sometimes dialing back that feedback in different ways can have a profound effect on the experience. Of course, accessibility is like an important thing to think about. So you really want to find the balance between having options that accommodate preferences and navigation ability, so you just don't discourage exploration for a lot of people. World 4 is a very extreme example, so I don't think it's like the best rule of thumb for everyone. So, using spatial tricks to withhold environmental reveal. Now, World 4 is full of spatial tricks Blending surface materials, reducing depth cues, mazing, a lot of right angles, blind corners, constrained sight lines with these like narrow doorways to hide things in the periphery, on-screen noise, vertical drops, looping pathways that return back to previous locations, and false walls being a very, very big part of it. Now, these are all things that you can find in like other GDC talks or like some good level design literature, like an architectural approach to level design by Christopher Totten. But what's important is how you use them within a level's layout. So the more densely you use them, or the more frequently you use them, the more you can compel a player to adjust and rethink intuitive spatial knowledge. So the odd trick and everything can, raise a question or be like a nice little designer's joke. But then when you begin introducing these more frequently and bending the rules as to how you're using these tricks, you can really slow navigation down and extend the reveal of the game. Because as players become more accustomed to them and the different kinds of tricks, what they want to do is kind of find them and also figure out how they might, resolve them or how they work. So they end up trying to get in the head of the designer. And I'm sure a lot of like puzzle game designers here would really, kind of understand that in a way. So the idea is that using spatial tricks raises questions to the like overt, immediate realities of the game space. So like, did I miss something around the corner there? Or did I notice this technique here, this false wall in a previous location? I might go back and have a look there. So yeah, subverting that kind of like the space through tricks should be tested, I suppose. And you really want to try and balance like wayfinding and good navigation techniques and levels, as well as like spatial tricks in order to like not overwhelm the player, and also provide an opportunity for players to return in their own time. So if they miss a trick or they don't really understand it or it just confuses them or disorientates, you can provide one pathway and force someone to understand it, but providing another avenue of exploration and opportunity to return to that trick, it just increases the likelihood that somebody might pick up on it over time. So it really is a matter of context and how much you want to like, reinforce the importance of that trick. So for instance, in World 4, players would, as they became more and more accustomed to tricks, became used to like slowing down and basically picking them. Sort of like Where's Wally of level design, I suppose, at certain points. Where's the hidden door? Where's the gap in the level? Where's the blind corner? Which was quite fun in a way for me to watch, and it seemed quite fun for players as well. So there's many great examples of like spatial tricks at work in levels. I'm very partial to Diretza and how it uses like blind corners and vertical drops to surprise players, and also different contrasting spatial dimensions. Like small spaces, big spaces, hidden nooks, and so on, within like a very directed level layout, and also using this kind of like natural, setting as well. And a very interesting one is Catacombs of Solaris by Ian McClarty, which introduces an algorithmic element where the generation of wall surfaces and its texture changes when the player stops. And then as you start moving, you can tell that the levels, or you can't really tell that the levels changed. And this is also a really good example of removing feedback as well. That kind of like raises question as to the nature of the game environment, and the whole experience of the game is kind of figuring out like exactly how does this game work? How is it tricking me? Finally, the use of misinformation to disrupt clear understandings. Now, within World 4, it's a research project. It was made, pretty hodgepodge, and as a result, there was quite a few bugs and glitches. You can see the default Unity skybox there, the blue seam. What's interesting is that within the context of the game and finding different kinds of doorways and its kind of abstract visual design, things like this seam here to some people seemed like it was intended, or that it was actually linking to something or connected to something else. I didn't intend this at all. I'm just very lucky that this played into the game's experience. One player in particular that this GIF has been taken from really was so sure that this was a new location and was determined to solve it, and would return to locations to figure it out. And I didn't intend for this, but I was absolutely fascinated as to the effect that this had. So by introducing deceptive elements that are never explained or given an answer to, unknowns are basically surfaced, and this can augment the game world to be more mysterious or contradictory and ultimately unknowable. By placing misinformation next to more obvious things like spatial tricks, you can really impress the legibility of misinformation, that it actually has significance, and force players to decide, should it be given credence or should they investigate it? You can think of it as design deception in a way. Allowing, depending on the type of game you're making, allowing for sort of unintended glitches or this kind of like variability can really add variety. However, it's important to consider that like if you keep caking on misinformation and add too much, then it introduces perhaps too much uncertainty that can make the world unintelligible and ruin the deception. So there's some really interesting examples of this in games, particularly in Gone Home. So Gone Home is about exploring a kind of domestic setting, a house. However, it plays a lot on haunted house tropes in order to make it seem like it's a horror game. Uses a lot of like narrative red herrings. But what's interesting is that it has these discoverable hidden locations that have specific objects that don't contribute to the central story, but instead misinform the player by making them think that there's something terrifying or some sort of horror thing going on, like this kind of like hidden seance sort of like chamber. And there's also like a buried crucifix down another little like nook hidden in the house. And what this misinformation does is mislead expectations. It keeps players on edge. It's so much fun watching Let's Plays of people playing Gone Home and just absolutely, certain that the monster's going to jump out of the closet or something like that and get them. And it keeps players looking for horror clues and really influences the way that they read the world and all the surrounding elements as well as they navigate. And a really interesting example of this is Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, which makes significant use of misinformation throughout to convey an experience of psychosis. These include characters and 3D objects changing in appearance, depending on player orientation, and then also surface textures that will change and blend between two different types. For instance, these bricks here look like bricks, but then at random, as far as I can tell, at random intervals or certain points in the game, these eyes, blinking eyes, subtly fade into the brick texture, which really gives the whole experience of exploration this very unsettling, unknowable edge. Could there be other things changing within the environment that you're not privy to or aware of? What are the limitations of your perception, and can you overcome them? And so on. So, those are the 4 different ways of thinking about ambiguity. I hope it was insightful and it gets you thinking about exploration and ambiguity in your own ways with your own games. If you'd like more information about these and the other 2, I've got papers and documents and a whole thesis, if you want, about these that I'd be very happy to share with you, and they're also available through my website. So, if you'd like to play World 4, there's a link to it as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me, or you can chat to me afterwards or email me and so on. So thank you very much.
Is it on? No. Okay. Did you have any instructions for the player, or did you kind of just set them down and let them go?
Set them down and let them go.
So no, like, walking instructions, no...
I did, on the download page, there is like WSAD to move and mouse to control,
Yep.
but nothing else. Of course, people tend to experiment and push different buttons to see what happens, but you try to be as upfront about like what the inputs are and then go from there. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
No worries.
Hi. It seems like one of the dangers of like ambiguity and ambiguous design like this is that you're going to create frustration in the player if they can't sort of find out what they need to move the game state forward. Provided that's not something that you're trying to design for, do you think it's possible to design in a way that is both ambiguous and doesn't have that problem? Or are you just trading in frustration if you're designing with ambiguity?
It's a really good question, and it's something I'm trying to figure out at the moment. Because with World 420, if I'm aiming to make it a commercial release, and that's an environment where, of course, accessibility and being able to like telegraph and communicate things to the player becomes way more of an important thing, especially when people are putting money up for it. So I think you can find a balance. It's just a matter of like taking those good tried and true design lessons and kind of using them appropriately, not to undermine necessarily the ambiguity, but to provide levity. So having these ambiguous elements, but then having some sort of like, kind of clearer sources of information. So like I'm lucky because I'm building into the Walker kind of like ideas that there's always going to be like movement, WSAD movement, and a mouse. So everyone can kind of like depend on that. But in terms of broader structural questions like objectives or where the boundaries of the environment is or where's a location to reach, that's a harder question and one I'm kind of grappling with at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No?
Hi, Jeff.
No, okay.
I wanted to ask, when you design ambiguity, do you have any goals for the player in mind, or is it just purely to explore?
For me, it was to purely explore. Of course, like it all depends on like how you use it and like the context of that use. But for me, it was purely about like spatial navigation and how can you create that kind of like desire to chart out a space, look at the space, and kind of take it in in different ways. So it was just purely about exploration. But that's not to say you can't use ambiguity in many different ways. Writers do it all the time, particularly games writers or environmental artists and so on. So yeah, for me, it's very much about like spatiality and navigation. But that's not to say that you shouldn't use it any other way. Yeah.
Thank you. May I ask another question as well?
Yeah. Go ahead.
How do you decide once you've done creating this world if you have no goal?
So how do I decide if I have no goal?
Well, if you've got no goal for the player, how do you decide once you've created the experience?
So yeah, that's an interesting one. It's really about like so the game loops in on itself, and it's one of those things where for me it's about how satisfied is somebody when they're choosing to turn off the game. So that might be 15 minutes where somebody plays, they see a few different things, they're like, I don't really understand this, and it's a bit weird to comprehend. That's cool, and I'm fine with that, because this is an experimental kind of like art design project. And what's interesting is that there's the opposite kind of players who will be like, I'm going to play this for an hour, and I really want to try and map and chart out this space. So at the moment, like I've kind of found my way into that through these different kinds of design techniques. But in terms of like balancing that kind of directing people or providing like suggestions as to there being things there or things to discover versus, not really having much of a goal or a destination to end up at, is tricky. It kind of links back to the other question in a way. So something I'm figuring out.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cool. Ooh.
How would you go about
Ooh.
How would you go about implementing some of these design philosophies to genres outside the walking simulator? So how would you implement some of the ideas of ambiguity to, say, an RPG or a roguelike or whatever?
Yep. I think quite a few of these, I think they're broad enough that they can translate. It just requires like, you know, a bit of like ingenuity on your part or the part of the designer. For instance, like the aspect of multiple sources of information. Like RPGs kind of deal with these qualities already, right? Where you have, you know, map overlays and then different levels of interface on the UI or in the game world, such as like highlighting, you know, pathways or secrets, items that change the environment. Legend of Zelda being an example. So, you know, there's different ways you can approach these kinds of like ways of thinking with different genres, but for most of the part, these lend themselves quite well to kind of like first person or third person sort of exploration games. So it's a bit tricky. It's actually funny, one of the big inspirations for the multiple sources of information, that quality came from, not from a walking simulator, but from Steel Battalion, which is a mech game that I love very much, and it has multiple kind of like viewports on screen. Objects in Space also does this as well. So yeah, you never quite know how these things fit, so kind of think of them more as provocations, and then how you can kind of like rethink certain genre aspects or design aspects to, you know, kind of like complement these ideas. Cool. Great. Well, thank you all very... Oh, yes.
Do you ever take accessibility into account when designing this?
Just face the mic. Go on, yeah.
Yeah, do you ever take accessibility when it comes to designing, especially World 4, into account? Like certain types of colour blindness, like you'd have Dear Esther and Going Home, where it's not really an issue, but there are some points within this where if you are even just changing the colour, where it just does sort of blend together.
Yeah, so when I was making it, like, wasn't considering that whatsoever. I was being very selfish. But since I've been like demoing it publicly and taking it around a lot, it's something that's like top priority, because yeah, like it's not just accessibility in terms of overcoming like the difficulties of navigation, but just basic things like color blindness. So that's something that like I'll very much be considering like in designing the game for its like next version. But it's something I really didn't factor into as much when I was coming up with these you know, different ways of thinking. So it's like, it really is a matter of finding the right balance, I suppose, in terms of making things like accessible or accommodating, while also like having that kind of ambiguous quality that's elusive. So perhaps like, I think Breath of the Wild's an interesting example, because you can kind of turn options on and off. So maybe it is a matter of like, you know, allowing for changing the materials, for instance, or the textures of the game world to allow for someone who has color blindness, for example. So yeah, there's a lot of like room for me to think about in that regard, and perhaps for all of you as well. Yeah, thank you.
In World 420, I feel like going through the world, like you got this like wonderful kind of vague, ambiguous world. There's got to be like, is it going to be like a climax or like some kind of explanation, like a reward for the player at the end?
Yeah, so like a big part of it is secrets. So like, you know, things buried in the environment that you really have to work at or like luck your way into finding. So what I have in the current version of the game is like a lot of like weird buried stuff that you can kind of stumble into. And what I'm looking for you know, World 420 is to have these things kind of coalesce and kind of, you know, kind of like thematically link together or break apart at certain points. And that's like what I'm actually mapping out at the moment through like a lot of like design sketching and things like that. It's kind of difficult figuring that out, especially trying to like playing with these ideas of imbuing meaning into the game level and like through these different objects and stuff. But yeah, the idea is like having things build towards something. So the further you get out towards the fringes, the more you begin finding things that are kind of like of significance, I suppose, and how these things might relate to each other or loop back on themselves. So yeah, thank you. Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much.